Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, from 1892 to 1973. Chapter 1.
"It is to be done," he said to himself desperately, and slowly he turned his way to the great gates. This time, since it was after 9 noon, the gates were ajar, and the keeper of the gate idled upon the threshold, picking his teeth with a bamboo sliver after his meal. He was a tall fellow with a large mole upon his left cheek, and from the mole hung 3 long black hairs which had never been cut. When Wang Long appeared, he shouted roughly, thinking from the basket that he had come to sell something. "Now then, what?" With great difficulty, Wang Long replied, "I am Wang Long, the farmer." "Well, and Wang Long, the farmer, what?" retorted the gateman, who was polite to none except the rich friends of his master and mistress. I am come, faltered Wang Long. "That I see," said the gateman with elaborate patience, twisting the long hairs of his mole. "There is a woman," said Wang Long, his voice sinking to a whisper. In the sunshine his face was wet. The gateman gave a great laugh. "So you are he roared. "I was told to expect a bridegroom today, but I did not recognize you with a basket on your arm." "It is only a few meats," said Wang Long, apologetically, waiting for the gateman to lead him within. But the gateman did not move. At last Wang Long said with anxiety, "Shall I go alone?" The gateman affected a start of horror. The old lord would kill you. Then, seeing that Wang Long was too innocent, he said, "A little silver is a good key." Wang Long saw at last that the man wanted money of him. "I am a poor man," he said pleadingly. "Let me see what you have in your girdle," said the gateman. And he grinned when Wang Long, in his simplicity, actually put his basket upon the stones, and lifting his robe, took out the small bag from his girdle, and shook into his left hand what money was left after his purchases. There was 1 silver piece and 14 copper pence. "I will take the silver," said the gateman coolly, and before Wang Long could protest, the man had the silver in his sleeve and was striding through the gate, bawling loudly, "The bridegroom, the bridegroom!" Wang Long, in spite of anger at what had just happened and horror at this loud announcing of his coming, could do nothing but follow, and this he did, picking up his basket and looking neither to the right nor to the left. Afterwards, although it was the first time he had ever been in a great family's house, he could remember nothing. With his face burning and his head bowed, he walked through court after court, hearing that voice roaring ahead of him, hearing tinkles of laughter on every side. Then suddenly, when it seemed to him he had gone through 100 courts, the gateman fell silent and pushed him into a small waiting room. There he stood alone while the gateman went into some inner place, returning in a moment to say, "The old mistress says you are to appear before her." Wang Long started forward, but the gateman stopped him, crying in disgust, "You cannot appear before a great lady with a basket on your arm, a basket of pork and bean curd. How will you bow?" "True, true," said Wang Long in agitation, but he did not dare to put the basket down because he was afraid something might be stolen from it. It did not occur to him that all the world might not desire such delicacies as 2 pounds of pork and 6 ounces of beef and a small pond fish. The gateman saw his fear and cried out in great contempt, "In a house like this we feed these meats to the dogs." And seizing the basket, He thrust it behind the door and pushed Wang Long ahead of him. Down a long, narrow veranda they went, the roofs supported by delicate carven posts, and into a hall the like of which Wang Long had never seen. A score of houses, such as his whole house, could have been put into it and have disappeared. So wide were the spaces, so high the roofs. Lifting his head in wonder to see the great carven and painted beams above him, he stumbled upon the high threshold of the door and would have fallen except that the gateman caught his arm and cried out, "Now will you be so polite as to fall on your face like this before the old mistress?" And collecting himself in great shame, Wang Long looked ahead of him, and upon a dais in the center of the room he saw a very old lady, her small fine body clothed in lustrous pearly gray satin, and upon the low bench beside her a pipe of opium stood burning over its little lamp. She looked at him out of small sharp black eyes, as sunken and sharp as a monkey's eyes in her thin and wrinkled face. The skin of her hand that held the pipe's end was stretched over her little bones, as smooth and as yellow as the gilt upon an idol. Wang Long fell to his knees and knocked his head on the tiled floor. "Raise him," said the old lady to the gateman. "These obeisances are not necessary. Has he come for the woman?" "Yes, ancient one," replied the gateman. "Why does he not speak for himself?" asked the old lady. "Because he is a fool, ancient one," said the gateman, twirling the hairs of his mole.
This roused Wang Long, and he looked with indignation at the gateman. "I am only a coarse person, great and ancient lady," he said. "I do not know what words to use in such a presence." The old lady looked at him carefully and with perfect gravity, and made as though she would have spoken, except that her hand closed upon the pipe which a slave had been tending for her, and at once she seemed to forget him. She bent and sucked greedily at the pipe for a moment, and the sharpness passed from her eyes, and a film of forgetfulness came over them. Wang Long remained standing before her until in passing her eyes caught his figure. "What is this man doing here?" she asked with sudden anger. It was as though she had forgotten everything. The gateman's face was immovable. He said nothing. "I am waiting for the woman, great lady," said Wang Long in much astonishment. "The woman? What woman?" the old lady began, but the slave girl at her side stooped and whispered, and the lady recovered herself. "Ah, yes, I forgot for the moment. A small affair. You have come for the slave called O-lan. I remember we promised her to some farmer in marriage. You are that farmer?" "I am he," replied Wang Long. "Call O-lan quickly," said the old lady to her slave. It was as though she was suddenly impatient to be done with all this, and to be left alone in the stillness of the great room with her opium pipe. And in an instant the slave appeared, leading by the hand a square, rather tall figure, clothed in clean blue cotton coat and trousers. Wang Long glanced once and then away, his heart beating. This was his woman. "Come here, slave," said the old lady carelessly. "This man has come for you." The woman went before the lady and stood with bowed head and hands clasped. "Are you ready?" asked the lady. The woman answered slowly as an echo, "Ready." Wang Long, hearing her voice for the first time, looked at her back as she stood before him. It was a good enough voice, not loud, not soft, plain and not ill-tempered. The woman's hair was neat and smooth, and her coat clean.
He saw with an instant's disappointment that her feet were not bound, but this he could not dwell upon, for the old lady was saying to the gateman, "Carry her box out to the gate, and let them be gone." And then she called Wang Long and said, "Stand beside her while I speak." And when Wang Long had come forward, she said to him, "This woman came into our house when she was a child of 10. and here she has lived until now, when she is 20 years old. I bought her in a year of famine when her parents came south because they had nothing to eat. They were from the north in Shantung, and there they returned, and I know nothing further of them. You see, she has the strong body and the square cheeks of her kind. She will work well for you in the field and drawing water and all else that you wish. She is not beautiful, but that you do not need. Only men of leisure have the need for beautiful women to divert them. Neither is she clever, but she does well what she is told to do, and she has a good temper. So far as I know, she is a virgin.
She has not beauty enough to tempt my sons and grandsons, even if she had not been in the kitchen. If there has been anything, it has been only a serving man. Take her and use her well. She is a good slave, although somewhat slow and stupid, but she is good enough for the kitchen. And to the woman she said, obey him and bear him sons and yet more sons. Bring the first child to me to see. Yes, ancient mistress, said the woman submissively. They stood hesitating, and Wang Long was greatly embarrassed, not knowing whether he should speak or what. Well, go, will you? Said the old lady in irritation, and Wang Long, bowing hastily, turned and went out, the woman after him, and after her the gateman carrying on his shoulder the box. This box he dropped down in the room where Wang Long returned to find his basket and would carry it no further, and indeed he disappeared without another word.
Then Wang Long turned to the woman and looked at her for the first time. She had a square, honest face, a short, broad nose with large black nostrils, and her mouth was wide, a gash in her face. Her eyes were small and of a dull black in color, and were filled with some sadness that was not clearly expressed. It was a face that seemed habitually silent and unspeaking, as though it could not speak if it would. She bore patiently Wang Long's look, without embarrassment or response, simply waiting until he had seen her. He saw that it was true there was not beauty of any kind in her face, a brown, common, patient face. But there were no pockmarks on her dark skin, nor was her lip slit. In her ears he saw his rings hanging, the gold wash rings he had bought, and on her hands were the rings he had given her. He turned away with secret exultation. Well, he had this woman. Here is this box and this basket, he said gruffly. Without a word, she bent over and picking up one end of the box, she placed it upon her shoulder and staggering under its weight, tried to rise. He watched her at this and suddenly he said, I will take the box. Here is the basket. And he shifted the box to his own back, regardless of the best robe he wore. And she, still speechless, took the handle of the basket. He thought of the 100 courts he had come through and of his figure absurd under its burden. If there were a side gate, he muttered, and she nodded after a little thought, as though she did not understand too quickly what he said. Then she led the way through a small unused court that was grown up with weeds, its pool choked, and there under a bent pine tree was an old round gate that she pulled loose from its bar, and they went through and into the street. Once or twice he looked back at her. She plodded along steadily on her big feet as though she had walked there all her life, her white face expressionless. In the gate of the wall he stopped uncertainly and fumbled in his girdle with one hand for the pennies he had left, holding the box steady on his shoulder with the other hand. He took out 2 pence, and with these he bought 6 small green peaches. Take these and eat them for yourself, he said gruffly. She clutched them greedily, as a child might, and held them in her hand without speech. When next he looked at her as they walked along the margin of the wheat fields, she was nibbling one cautiously. But when she saw him looking at her, She covered it again with her hand and kept her jaws motionless. And thus they went until they reached the western field where stood the temple to the earth. This temple was a small structure, not higher in all than a man's shoulder, and made of gray bricks and roofed with tile. Wang Lung's grandfather, who had farmed the very fields upon which Wang Lung now spent his life, had built it, hauling the bricks from the town upon his wheelbarrow. The walls were covered with plaster on the outside, and a village artist had been hired in a good year once to paint upon the white plaster a scene of hills and bamboo. But the rain of generations had poured upon this painting until now there was only a faint feathery shadow of bamboos left, and the hills were almost wholly gone. Within the temple, snugly under the roof, sat two small solemn figures, earthen, for they were formed from the earth of the fields about the temple. These were the god himself and his lady. They wore robes of red and gilt paper, and the god had a scant, drooping mustache of real hair. Each year at the new year, Wang Lung's father bought sheets of red paper and carefully cut and pasted new robes for the pair. And each year rain and snow beat in, and the sun of summer shone in and spoiled their robes. At this moment, however, the robes were still new, since the year was but well begun, and Wang Lung was proud of their spruce appearance. He took the basket from the woman's arm, and carefully he looked about under the pork for the sticks of incense he had bought. He was anxious lest they were broken, and thus make an evil omen, but they were whole, and when he had found them, he stuck them side by side in the ashes of other sticks of incense that were heaped before the gods, for the whole neighborhood worshipped these two small figures. Then, fumbling for his flint and iron, he caught with a dried leaf for tinder a flame to light the incense. Together this man and this woman stood before the gods of their fields. The woman watched the ends of the incense redden and turn gray. When the ash grew heavy, she leaned over, and with her forefinger she pushed the head of ash away. They stood there in complete silence, side by side, while incense burnt into ashes. And then, because the sun was sinking, Wang Lung shouldered the box, and they went home. At the door of the house, the old man stood to catch the last rays of the sun upon him. He made no movement as Wang Lung approached with the woman. It would have been beneath him to notice her. Instead, he feigned great interest in the clouds, and he cried,
"That cloud which hangs upon the left horn of the new moon speaks of rain. It will not come later than tomorrow night." And then, as he saw Wang Lung take the basket from the woman, he cried out again, "And have you spent money?" Wang Lung set the basket on the table. "There will be guests tonight," he said briefly, and he carried the box into the room where he slept and set it down beside the box where his own clothes were. He looked at it strangely. But the old man came to the door and said volubly, "There is no end to the money spent in this house." Wang Lung said nothing, but he went out and took the basket into the kitchen, and the woman followed him there. He took the food piece by the piece from the basket and laid it upon the ledge of the cold stove, and he said to her, "Here is pork, and here is beef and fish. There are 7 to eat. Can you prepare food?" He did not look at the woman as he spoke. The woman answered in her plain voice,
"I have been kitchen slave since I went into the house of Huang. There were meats at every meal." Wang Lung nodded and left her, and did not see her again until the guests came crowding in. His uncle, jovial and sly and hungry, his uncle's son, an impudent lad of 15, and the farmers, clumsy and grinning with shyness. 2 were men from the village with whom Wang Lung exchanged seed and labor at harvest time, and 1 was his next-door neighbor, Ching, a small, quiet man, ever unwilling to speak unless he were compelled to it. After they had been seated about the middle room with demurring and unwillingness to take seats for politeness, Wang Lung went into the kitchen to bid the woman serve. Then he was pleased when she said to him, I will hand you the bowls if you will place them upon the table. I do not like to come out before men. Wang Lung felt in him a great pride that this woman was his and did not fear to appear before him, but would not before other men. He took the bowls from her hands at the kitchen door and set them upon the table in the middle room and called loudly, Eat, my uncle and my brothers. And when the uncle, who was fond of jokes, said, Are we not to see the bride? Wang Lung replied firmly, We are not yet one. It is not meet that other men see her until the marriage is consummated. And he urged them to eat, and they ate heartily of the good fare, heartily and in silence. And this one praised the brown sauce on the fish, and that one the well-done pork. And Wang Lung said over and over in reply, It is poor stuff. It is badly prepared. But in his heart he was proud of the dishes, for with what meat she had, the woman had combined sugar and vinegar and a little wine and soy sauce, and she had skillfully brought forth all the force of the meat itself, so that Wang Lung himself had never tasted such dishes upon the tables of his friends. That night, after the guests had tarried along over their tea and had done with their jokes, the woman still lingered behind the stove, and when Wang Lung had seen the last guest away, he went in, and she cowered there in the straw piles asleep beside the ox. There was straw in her hair when he roused her, and when he called her, she put up her arms suddenly in her sleep, as though to defend herself from a blow. When she opened her eyes at last, she looked at him with a strange, speechless gaze, and he felt as though he faced a child. He took her by the hand and led her into the room where that morning he had bathed himself for her, and he lit a red candle upon the table. In this light he was suddenly shy when he found himself alone with the woman, and he was compelled to remind himself, There is this woman of mine. The thing is to be done. As for the woman, she crept around the corner of the curtain and began without a sound to prepare for the bed. Wang Long said gruffly, When you lie down, put the light out first. Then he lay down and drew the thick quilt about his shoulders and pretended to sleep. But he was not sleeping. He lay quivering, every nerve of his flesh awake.